They gathered at the waterfront in their Sunday best hats tilted, cameras ready, newspapers watching. It was January 1st, 1914, the world's first scheduled passenger flight. A single-engine seaplane bobbed gently in the water, piloted by Tony Janis, a 25-year-old daredevil aviator. Next to him sat Abram File, the former mayor of St. Petersburg, Florida. He'd paid $400 at auction for this honor to be the first commercial air passenger in history. The crowd held its breath as the Benoist XIV roared to life and lifted off the bay. 23 minutes later, only silence remained. What happened in the skies over Tampa Bay was never fully explained. But the wreckage, what little there was, washed ashore for weeks. 2 lives were lost, but something else died that day too. The world's naive faith in flight. And what came out of the water wasn't just twisted metal, it was the beginning of a fear we still carry when the cabin doors close and wheels leave the earth. They said it would be the dawn of a new era, man taking to the skies not for war or sport, but for something truly modern: business, speed, progress. In the crisp morning air of St. Petersburg, Florida, the Benoist XIV seaplane shimmered like a promise. Newspapers across the country had sent reporters. Telegraph stories would beam coast to coast within hours. And at the center of it all, 2 men who couldn't have been more different. Tony Janis was the embodiment of early aviation swagger. Tall, lean, charming. He had flown warplanes for the Navy, done stunts for Daredevil expos, and once dropped oranges from the air just to prove he could. To him, this flight was almost boring. 23 miles? Over flat bay waters, a child's game. But he knew the cameras were watching, and he loved the spotlight. His passenger, Abram C. File, was a banker and former mayor, nervous, stiff, and out of place in the small open-air cockpit. He wore a suit far too warm for the weather and a bowler hat that he clutched like a lifeline. He had won the honor of first passenger by bidding $400, an astronomical sum, in 1914. For him, it was legacy, his name in the history books. His grandchildren would remember him. What neither of them knew was that someone else had made plans that morning too. At the edge of the dock stood a third man, nameless in most records. He wore a gray coat and wire-rimmed glasses and had arrived just before sunrise. A mechanic? A journalist? No one could say. But hours later, witnesses remembered him leaning over the engine cowling, hands moving with purpose. Not fast, not slow, just deliberate. The plane lifted off at 10:01 a.m. Cheers erupted from the crowd. Hats waved, cameras snapped. Janis gave a thumbs up. File managed a forced smile. The Benoist rose steadily, banked left, and climbed out over the water. At 10:17 a.m., it vanished, not exploded, not crashed. Just gone. There was no wireless communication aboard, no radar, no black box. Just a group of stunned onlookers staring into a sky that had swallowed 2 men whole. The first search boats were out by 10:30. A Coast Guard cutter joined an hour later. But all they found was a single broken strut and a patch of scorched canvas floating 8 miles off the shoreline. No bodies, no plane, no survivors. The press was caught off guard. They had been writing headlines before the flight even left the dock. The sky belongs to the people, a new chapter in human progress. Instead, by nightfall, the papers read, "Tragedy mars historic flight. Sky's first civilian victim" behind the headlines. Though, was something even stranger. At the hangar where the Benoist had been stored the night before, police found the tool chest open. Several parts missing. The head mechanic, Walter "Smitty" Graves, said he had done a final inspection before dawn and everything was in working order. But when shown the recovered strut charred and splintered, he went pale. This wasn't from stress," he said. "This was tampered with. That break is too clean." He never made that statement publicly. Within days, Smitty had resigned and left town. Some say he moved west. Others claim he drank himself into obscurity. What we know is that he refused to talk about the flight for the rest of his life. But it wasn't just mechanics and mystery that haunted the town. It was what people claimed they saw or heard. One fisherman swore he watched the plane suddenly dip mid-air and vanish in a ball of light, though others said it was just the sun glinting off the water. A woman walking the beach near Point Pinellas said she heard a scream, not a human one. but something high-pitched and metallic like metal being torn apart mid-air. Local papers chalked it up to hysteria. After all, this was a town that had just watched two men disappear into thin air, but those closest to the case weren't convinced. And then came the letters. 3 days after the crash, the St. Petersburg Times received an anonymous envelope. Inside was a handwritten note in slanted cursive. "The air is not ready. The water reclaims what man tries to steal. Let this be the first and the last," he was warned. No return address, no fingerprints, no further explanation. The editors dismissed it as the work of a crank. But when a second letter arrived 2 days later, this time addressed to the mayor, with the same handwriting, they took it to the police. The letter simply read, "Fire cleanses, do not build again." It wasn't long before people began whispering about curses, about divine warnings, about the sky being a domain we were never meant to conquer. Yet despite the grief, the fear, the superstition, something else began to happen. Newspapers in Chicago, New York, and London wrote about the flight with awe, not just sorrow. Aviation pioneers like Glenn Curtiss and Orville Wright commented publicly. They called the loss tragic, but inevitable. Some even compared it to the early deaths of railroad workers in the 1800 sacrifices for a greater good. Still, not everyone believed it was an accident. One man, a young newspaper intern named Elias Browder, began collecting every rumor, every witness statement, every thread of uncertainty. He would later publish a pamphlet titled Flight 1, The Questions No One Asked. In it, he proposed a theory, that the flight had been sabotaged not out of malice, but as a warning. He pointed to a little-known court case from the previous year, in which a small shipping consortium had sued the city for favoring the aviation route over ferry contracts. Browder noted that one of the plaintiffs had gone bankrupt just months before the flight, and had allegedly vowed to bring down the whole foolish scheme, but no proof ever surfaced, no arrests, no trial. And so the story of the first passenger flight quietly faded into footnotes, a brief mention in history books, a single plaque near the bay, no statues, no tributes, just whispers. But the fear it planted, that lived on. Air travel would recover. It always does. But the memory of that flight, the joy, the silence, the fire never quite left the people who watched it vanish. And for those who stood at the dock that morning, cheering, waving, believing, it would be years before they trusted the sky again. By spring of 1914, the waters of Tampa Bay were warmer, calmer. The search had long since ended. The town, for the most part, had moved on. But the bay had not. It began with a fisherman. March 9th, his name was Ellis Keegan, 61 years old, a veteran of the Gulf. He was laying nets just before sunrise near the outer edge of the channel when his boat struck something submerged. Not a rock, not a sandbar, metal. He reached overboard and his hands closed around a half-melted piece of propeller. One blade curled in like a claw, the other sheared off entirely. When he pulled it on board, he said it smelled not of salt or sea, but of oil and scorched leather, like it had been burning, even underwater. He didn't go to the police. Not at first. He went to a bar. And after 3 shots of whiskey, he told the bartender what he'd found. By evening, the town buzzed again, not with celebration, but with a nervous kind of remembering. The next day, a local diver named Charles Linden offered to go down and investigate the site. He was young, brash, and unafraid of ghosts, so he said. He borrowed equipment from the Navy Reserve Station nearby and dove alone. What he found he never spoke of publicly. But his journal, discovered decades later, told a different story. The wreck is deeper than expected, nearly 40 feet down, but intact. Cockpit mostly crushed, wings gone. Engine melted into the frame. But I swear I saw something burned into the metal. Not corrosion, not rust. A symbol, circular, with 3 intersecting lines like an eye. It wasn't part of the original design. I touched it. It was warm. He surfaced after only 7 minutes, shaking, refusing to go back down. When pressed by reporters, he claimed the wreck was too degraded to recover, that the currents were too strong, that it wasn't worth the risk, but weeks later, he left Florida entirely. No goodbye, just gone. It didn't end there. Over the next 6 months, debris washed ashore sporadically. Pieces of fabric, parts of the fuselage, even a glove. But nothing human. No bone, no clothing, no trace of Tony Janis or Abram File. And then, on October 3rd, a letter arrived at the home of File's widow. No postage mark. No return address, just a single envelope slipped under her door. Inside was a photograph. It showed two men's faces partially obscured standing beside what looked like a jungle clearing. Behind them was wreckage. A partial wing, maybe, a tree had grown through it. On the back someone had written, "They lived for a while." The photo was analyzed, but inconclusive. The plant life did resemble southern Florida or possibly Central America, but neither man could be positively identified, and the handwriting didn't match anyone connected to the case. Police called it a cruel prank. Mrs. File never spoke of it again, but she kept the photo until the day she died, locked in a drawer. What if the plane hadn't gone down where they thought? What if it had made it further? Some theorists latched onto this idea, that perhaps Janis, sensing engine failure, had veered south in hopes of reaching land. That maybe they crash-landed on one of the isolated mangrove islands dotting the coast, some of which weren't even mapped at the time. But if so, why no signal? Why no fire scene from shore? Why no remains? Others leaned into the paranormal. The symbol burned into the wreckage sparked all kinds of speculation. Occultists wrote articles connecting it to protection sigils, ancient glyphs, and even alchemical curses. A few claimed it was the same symbol seen carved into the rafters of a burned-down church in Missouri, the same town where Janis had been born. Coincidence? To some, yes. But to those watching closely, the case was no longer about accident versus sabotage. It had become something bigger. A question about what we awaken when we push too far, too soon. One man who believed that quietly, obsessively was Edward Kitchener, an engineer who had helped design early parts for the Benoist aircraft. He had never spoken publicly about the crash, but in private letters to a colleague in France he wrote, "They didn't account for resonance. Not just mechanical, but spiritual. The air has its own memory, its own language. Some forces don't like to be trespassed." Kitchener died in 1920. His notes were found only in 1987, stuffed in a box behind a false wall in his attic. It's easy to dismiss all of this. People do. Skeptics point out that early aviation was extremely dangerous, that hundreds of early pilots died in test flights between 1903 and 1918, that the Benoist, a wooden skeleton held together with piano wire, was never designed for true reliability. And they're not wrong. But still, something about this story lingers unresolved, restless. Even today, no one has ever conclusively proven what brought down the world's first passenger flight. No black box. No full wreckage recovery. No clear motive for sabotage. No proof of survivors. Just fragments, shadows, questions, and there's one more detail, a small one. But it's always bothered historians who study the case. The passenger list. You see, officially, there were only 2 people aboard the flight, Tony Janis and Abram File, but the original manifest, handwritten and kept in a now-lost city ledger, included one other name, a third line smudged, hard to read. But it's there in the scanned copy held at the city archives. A name no one has been able to trace. G. Allard. No ticket sale, no bid. No record of anyone by that name in St. Petersburg in 1914. Yet the name appears, faint and unmistakable, in a different ink. Who was G. Allard? A stowaway? A last-minute addition? A mistake? Or something else entirely? And if they were on the flight, where did they go? What did they see? And why did no one ever speak their name again? Time marched on, and with it, memory faded. The Great War erupted later that same year, in July 1914. The sky, once imagined as a peaceful road to progress, became a battlefield. Bombs fell from biplanes. Airships carried terror across borders. The names Janis and File vanished from the front page, replaced by casualty lists and declarations of war. But the first flight, was never forgotten. Not by everyone. In 1928, on the 14th anniversary of the disaster, a retired Navy officer named Silas Mackey gave an interview to a small aviation journal. He claimed to have been stationed on a supply vessel near the Gulf in early 1914, just miles from the reported crash area. He said he saw something, not a crash. Not a plane falling, but a shape silent, gliding overhead that shimmered in and out of view like a mirage. He described it as the frame of an aircraft, but wrong. Elongated, shadowed, and moving without engine noise. He said it left behind no wake, no contrail, no sound. Just a memory he could never explain. The journal didn't publish the full interview. It was too strange, they said. Too unprovable. But Mackey's original transcript ended up in the Library of Congress Aviation Archive, buried among thousands of forgotten testimonies. And then came 1935, that year. During dredging work near Egmont Key, a barge crew unearthed what they believed to be the remains of a wooden aircraft, parts of a fuselage, a rusted engine block. And inside, wrapped in what had once been oilcloth, they found a journal. Waterlogged, damaged, barely legible. But parts of it survived? Though no name was signed, aviation historians believe it may have belonged to Tony Janis. Here is what it said in the final entries. Third day, no signal, compass spins, file injured. Conscious but weak, heard something last night. Like wind but no wind, just pressure, water is calm but sky feels wrong. And later, sixth day. The other one hasn't spoken? We didn't take a third. I don't remember, but he's here. I see him standing near the edge when I wake, watching, doesn't eat, doesn't blink. I asked his name. He said, Ellard, that name again? A name that appeared nowhere official, a name that had no record before or after the flight. Yet it reappears quietly, persistently, in the strangest corners of the investigation. In a 1947 classified military memo reviewing unexplained disappearances during early flight missions, the name G. Ellard was circled and listed under Associated Phenomena Observational. In 1962, a retired radar technician claimed, in a private letter to his son, that during a Cold War test, an aircraft identical in appearance to a Benoist XIV briefly appeared on radar near the Florida coastline, only to vanish moments later without a signal. The technician's log notes included the name Gellard written in the margin, though he claimed not to remember why he wrote it. Coincidence? Or a thread we've been unwilling to pull? And maybe the most chilling account came much later. In 1989, a private pilot flying a routine solo trip from Tampa to Sarasota reported seeing what he thought was a vintage replica aircraft, gliding just a few hundred feet above the bay, silent, glinting in the sun, following no known flight path. He radioed it in. Air traffic control had nothing on radar. No sightings, no events scheduled. When asked what the pilot looked like, he said, couldn't see clearly, but he wasn't moving. Just staring straight ahead. And there was someone sitting beside him, slumped over, looked wrong, like he'd been there too long. The pilot landed safely, filed the report. The FAA dismissed it as an optical illusion. But he never flew again. Even now, historians debate whether the story of the first passenger flight is a tragedy or something stranger. A failed experiment, a cover-up, or an encounter with something beyond comprehension. Why did the plane disappear so quickly in clear skies? Why did no full body or skeleton ever surface, despite an intensive search and decades of accidental discoveries? Why did multiple sources, journals, manifests, letters all point to the presence of a third person, a man no one knew, a name that echoes through time, and most of all, why did the wreckage, when finally found, look like it had burned from the inside? There's one last detail buried in a museum basement in Clearwater, Florida. A single seat from a Benoist aircraft recovered in the 1950s by a local salvage diver. It's heavily damaged, warped from heat and pressure, and sealed behind glass. But if you stand close enough to see past the cracks, you'll find, scratched faintly into the underside of the wood, 5 words. We weren't supposed to fly. Was it fear, a confession? Or something left behind by a pilot who saw too much? Today we board planes without thinking. We chase clouds in aluminum tubes, trusting physics and strangers and schedules. We marvel at the miracle of flight, forgetting how unnatural it once seemed, how sacred the sky used to be. But every innovation carries a cost. Every frontier leaves someone behind, and sometimes something follows us back. The first passenger flight wasn't just a journey, it was a door. And no one ever asked what might be waiting on the other side.